Let's talk about why it's important to vote.
It seems like my generation has a general apathy about politics. Most teens and people in their 20s seem to care more about entertainment news and social media than they do about what is going on in our country and in the world. Voting is especially important today because of our current political situation. Many people, including myself, are very frustrated with the world politically. If people do not vote, then we can't change the problems of society. And that brings me to my topic of voter apathy. I will first talk about why it is important to care about elections. Then I will explain a brief history of voting. And finally, I will discuss why some people don't vote and what to do to decrease voter apathy. Our country is a democracy, which means that we have a say in how the government is run. Voting is the easiest way to get involved in the government and have your voice be heard. It ensures that our government has checks and balances. Other countries are not as lucky as we are, and they have no input in their government, and their lives are left in the hands of their leaders. Local elections see less turnout than national and presidential elections because most people do not believe it is as important to vote. However, for certain populations, specifically minorities, they have a better chance of getting their voices heard in local elections. In 2014, voter turnout for Latinos was only 27%. It was 40% for blacks and 46% for whites. It is important that minorities vote so the person elected to represent them is not left in the hands of wealthy white people who may have very different interests. Hajnal explains that limited and uneven participation has helped to restrict the number of minorities in local office, which in turn affects government spending priorities. As a result, Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans regularly end up on the losing side because their voices are more muted than they could be. Obtaining the right to vote was not easy. We fought hard to make sure that the United States is a democracy. Since our government was founded by white men, they were the first ones who received most of the rights. At one point, white male landowners were the only people allowed to vote. African American men were granted the right to vote through the 15th Amendment in 1870. However, the government found a way to still restrict African Americans from voting through poll taxes, literary tests, grandfather clauses, and other means. It wasn't until 1965 that it became illegal to discriminate against black voters through the National Voting Right Act. This act prohibited state use of literary tests and other means to exclude blacks from voting. Women were not given the right to vote because they were thought of as too emotional to make rational voting decisions. In 1890, the National American Woman Suffrage Association was formed to fight for women's rights to vote and have political identities. Movements by activists to grant women the right to vote included hunger strikes and White House pickets. Finally, in 1920, the hard work of women's suffrage activists paid off, and women received the right to vote through the ratification of the 19th Amendment. As you can see, it was a long road to receiving the right to vote. People fought hard for your right. They gave you a voice in the government, and you should use it.
The YSA, Youth Service America, explained that there are four main reasons why young people don't vote. The first reason is that they're not asked or encouraged to vote. If a young person's parents, friends, or teachers encourage them to vote, then they'd be more likely to consider voting.
The second reason listed is that there are too many barriers for them to overcome, which basically means that voting isn't easy enough to fit in their schedule. This could be not having a car to drive to a voting location, not having the right ID, or they feel the registration process is too difficult.
The third reason the YSA lists for low voter turnout for youths is that they don't know enough about politics or elections to vote. The last reason is just plain apathy. They do not care about the election and don't believe their vote will matter. It is important to increase voter turnout so the candidate that wins an election actually represents its citizens. One way to do this is to make voting easier. This could include increasing the amount of places where one can vote, making registration easier and having same-day registration, and providing free shuttles to voting locations. All of these things would make voting less difficult and would increase voter turnout. As I mentioned, young people are another group of people who don't vote. In order to decrease their apathy about voting, it is important for teachers and parents to encourage students to get involved with elections.
It is important to vote because as of now, the government has a strong bias toward wealthy white men. The more people who vote, the better the likelihood that different voices will be heard. Brave activists made it possible for the right to vote through persistence and determination. We should not take this right for granted. Recently, the rights of many people are at risk of being taken away by power-hungry political leaders. But if we vote more qualified people into office, then we can fight back. I hope after watching this, you strongly consider getting registered to vote and participating in your local and national elections.